I'll be moderating the panel. My name is John Katsos. I'm from the American University of Sharjah in the UAE, where I'm an associate professor of management. And thank you to all of the panelists and to everybody who's here for joining us this morning, or this afternoon for some of you. We have about an hour for our session. As the moderator, I'm going to try to keep a balance for all of our speakers and just keep the conversation going. So the focus of the session today is on multi-stakeholder dialogues. And so there's really two principles that we're going to discuss today. The main one is really principle one, which asks us all as educators to try to help develop the capabilities of students to be future generators of sustainable value for business and society, and also to try to work for an inclusive and sustainable global economy. And principle six asks us to do exactly what we're doing here, which is engage in this kind of dialogue for this purpose. And so with that in mind, what I'd like to do is just ask each of the speakers to briefly introduce themselves and their organizations. And we'll do that starting with, we'll sort of go around. So let's start with, we'll do counterclockwise, Viswanath, Jamil, Lesley, and Jaya. And when you introduce yourself to organizations, if you can, just spend a few minutes answering kind of our simple starter question, which is what are the kinds of capabilities students will need over the next decade to help them generate sustainable value for business and society. So with that, let's go to Viswanath first.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Nice meeting you. And a kind of a small statutory disclaimer, the views are personal. The views are from experience that I've gained through my career interacting with clients, interacting with students. Yeah, so I'm an executive director with KPMG. I'm from the transformation practice. I work with clients, bringing about changes in profitability, sustainable efficiencies. I work primarily in the consumer sector. That's professionally what I do. Would you want me to answer the sustainability question now, or would you want to just introduce the panelists first?
If you could, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead if you could.
All right, great. Okay, so, all right, so fantastic. Thank you. I think 3-4 things that I would like the students of tomorrow to really develop, right? We need to appreciate the fact that an average student today is far more connected to global news, global applications than ever before. However, what I find that they need to improve more on the soft skills aspects is one is emotional quotient. Somewhere the world getting confined in mobile screens has perhaps made many students go a little low on the emotional quotient perspective. And we believe that in the years to come, that is going to become extremely critical to develop sustainable businesses, sustainable supplier, vendor, customer relationships, sustainable wealth creation, right? It all starts with an emotional quotient, and emotional quotient getting into empathy, okay? I think that's one big skill which a lot of students may have to focus on. The second skill that I think students have to focus is the acceptance of duality of reality. And why do I say that? Coming from a country like India, and I'm sure it holds good for a lot of Southeast Asian economies and some of the Western economies, we only hear news of success stories, right? We hear stories of unicorns. We hear stories of successful fundraisers. We hear successful stories of investors selling at huge gains. But students need to realize that for every one success story, there could be 10x stories which perhaps have not made the cut, right? Today, we may need to understand, appreciate, and respect failure far more than what we respect success, especially in this part of the world. I see in the cultural context, the ability that you have not succeeded in an experiment in this part of the world is a very harsh acceptance, right? The society really doesn't respect you so much. But I've seen in other parts of the world, it doesn't matter. Right? So that is another aspect that I would want students to really imbibe as they start. Uh, the third soft aspect, which I think students need to really look and respect, is the respect for diversity. Okay. Today, we are in a world where we are troubled with a lot of instances which we see goes back to the fundamental truth of respect for diversity, respect for individuals as they are, and respect for a different view of thoughts, right? I may still disagree with a lot of people in this forum, but I will need to respect each one of you for what you bring onto the table. And that diversity, I think, can't be taught to students at a preschool level. I think that diversity and that respect needs to be taught at maybe the kindergarten level, right? Uh, I think diversity has to be brought in from there. To me, these are the top three things which I would really want to stress that management education has to really force. That's from my side. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Viswanath. And so let's shift to Jamil in Manila for his perspective.
Hi, so hello everyone. I'm delighted to be here as panel. I'm Jamil Francisco. I am Associate Dean at the Asian Institute of Management. We are a small business school in Manila. And I've actually been taking down notes from what I've been hearing from speakers. It is our in our interest, of course, to take note of what the industries are looking for. I do note, however, that these are skills which we've been hearing for many years now. These are what some people call your future skills, right? Or what will make us future ready, which will make us more competitive against robots and automation and whatnot. So it's the soft skills of empathy, of communication, these analytical skills, critical thinking, problem solving, and of course, embracing diversity. I would very much agree, of course, with Mr. Viswanath, with these being important skills. But I think there's an added challenge for business schools and universities actually in general. And that challenge is twofold. On the one hand, everything seems to have accelerated. So, if we thought we needed the digital skills last year, now we know that we should have had it 5 years ago, so that we would have been more ready and more resilient with the situation we are in. Before the panel start, John and I were joking around about how the digital infrastructure and internet was bad in our different localities. And I said, this seems to be a problem anywhere. And it's not just the digital infrastructure. I mean, truth be told, even I had to struggle getting online and whatnot. And that made me question my digital soft skills if being able to sign in to a webinar is classified as a digital soft skill. But now we just realize all the more is this necessary. Of course, the racial tensions and the issues arising all over the world, the US included, this brings to fore a realization that the things that, we've been talking about diversity for the longest time. But, when do we move now from diversity to actual equity, right? Sincere equity, so that it's not just a matter of tolerance or openness, but really everyone by default should be part of this whole solution. But the second point I wanted to stress was the interconnectedness. If there's anything that we might have learned from this crisis was how we are all interconnected with the same problems, the same challenges, or different ones, but certainly the actions of one affect the other. I think it's a challenge for business schools to keep that as a very important point that students will have to learn of how, we've been talking about the multiple bottom lines for a long time now, but truly the essence of public value, of the public value that the firm brings, that's something that we have to go now beyond the case study and actually show how there are actually so many companies now that, you cannot not think of the safety of your public. You cannot not think of the safety of your consumers. So that whole multiple perspectives of the bottom line and public value is, I think, something we should be able to ingrain more in our students.
Great. So if we can move to Lesley, if you could just introduce yourself and give us your take.
I think Lesley is on mute.
in the dark in New Zealand, so I thought I'd try for a bit more light here. So tēnā koutou katoa. This is greetings to you all from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I guess I'm going to draw on my own experience and training as a sustainability practitioner. I have been in an academic role before, but I, for the last 14 years, have been working in-house in a large service organisation that is a university. And my role is to facilitate implementation of our organisation's commitments to sustainability as formalised by our sustainability policy, our strategic plan, a number of strategic partnerships. So I'm coming at this very much as a practitioner. I guess from this perspective, I'd suggest that the knowledge and the skills needed by graduates wanting to lead and manage values-based change and learning within their organisations include probably the ones that you would probably see as red. But the essential things that I've noticed in practice is that a lot of graduates are coming out have a much more of a focus on theory and rhetoric than they do on actual practical application of management knowledge and skills. And so for me, the real important skills are ability to have a strong, clear vision of what their organisation would look like as a sustainable and a sustaining organisation. An understanding of the difference between policy-driven change and values-based change. And the importance of iterative learning in changing or building a culture conducive to sustainability. They also need the skills to assess the context of an organisation, including its reason for being, the historical and current forces that have shaped it, and those that are likely to have an influence into the future. Also, the roles, responsibilities, perspectives, and drivers of its people, whether and how their social needs are met, the way power and control are sought, gained, and exercised within and from outside the organisation, the extent to which the organisation enables and empowers sustainability champions, and this set of basic underlying assumptions that groups and individuals have learnt, developed, and transferred that inform an organisation's values and culture. So those of you who've had management training will probably recognise some of those things, or if not all of them. But I find that they're actually quite missing in a lot of the graduates that I guess come across my role in terms of people who are wanting to practice. So, the kinds of people who are coming looking for jobs in this area, or the kinds of people who are in the networks that we're part of. They really need to have the knowledge of the change management options that are available to them, and they need to have the skills to customize, design, and implement context-driven change management programs that will resonate across the organizations. The Sustainable Development Goals are fabulous for building resonance within our sector because they pretty much cover everything that universities do, or touch on everything that universities do, not only in teaching but also in service. But I'd suggest that they also help, well, I know because we've used them to do this, we've used them to create resonance in most other, in our sector, and I suspect they would work in many other sectors. We'd really be hard-pressed to find an organisation that does nothing of relevance to at least one, but more likely at least a number of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I guess we need graduates who have the ability to find, develop and implement strategies for navigating their way across these complex considerations when people are trying to affect change, real change within organisations. I just mentioned quickly around this current situation. Of course, there's no doubt that the novel coronavirus has had a major impact on our sector. And one of the big impacts is international students, and in terms of our country, it's tourism. So I guess many of you will be having similar sorts of issues, but for us, it's very critical. Of course, there have also been benefits in reducing our carbon emissions, and particularly through travel. Our institution travelled about 135 million kilometres last year, and that's been down to pretty much nothing over the last 2 or 3 months. So big changes in travel, in working from home, and in finding that we don't perhaps need as many buildings as we thought we did. It's going to be very interesting to see how we navigate this into the future, and I guess that's an issue for graduates as well, is how we don't just try to get the money flowing fast and dirty, and actually try to learn from what we've learned through this period, and be part of changes in the way we work and changes in the way we maybe even design our institutions. So yeah, in terms of the racial tension, that was another thing that was identified. I might be jumping ahead here, John, sorry if I am. But I don't think as an institution, I think certainly it's something that has changed. Well, it's really just brought home the importance of what we're already trying to do. I think we're already in our sector, in our country, really conscious of these issues. That doesn't mean we've sorted them, and that doesn't mean it'll be easy for us to continue to do so, but it's certainly we're very honest and open about them and the issues that they raise and the ways in which our institutions need to contribute towards equity and equality and diversity. So sorry if I've jumped ahead a bit, but
so if we could go to Jaya.
Thank you. There's always a disadvantage in speaking at the last, because everything that you wanted to say has been said, but it's such a great pleasure to be here. Jaya, my name is Jayashree. I am the Dean at the Faculty of Business in the University of Wollongong in Dubai. But as Vishwanath said a little while ago, all that I speak today is, there is a disclaimer. It's not from an institutional point of view, but as an educator, as somebody who works in the field of sustainability. I'm the board member for Water for People India, which is an international nonprofit based in Denver, which works in the area of clean water and sanitation solutions. It operates in 9 countries: Bolivia, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Peru, Malawi, Rwanda, Uganda, and I also am somebody whose research is in the area of change strategy, change management. So a lot of what I do as both as an educator and in my practical work with Water for People and my research is, is at the intersections of change, sustainability, essentially SDG goals, and I would say innovation. So that's the intersection that I inhabit. So, I mean, I completely agree with all that Vishwanath, Jamil, and Lesley said, that we are in, times when pursuance of sustainable goals and consciousness of and sensitivity to sustainable goals is no longer a frill. It has to become part of the, DNA of organizations, and it has to be, and again, as Vishwanath said, I wouldn't think it starts at universities. That process starts, that consciousness starts early on, and both nations and societies and the social groups that we have a role to play in it. And institutions such as universities, of course, become a very important part of that process. So even when you were speaking, I was really thinking about, so what exactly, where exactly do we start? And a thought came to my mind that, when we look at the paradigms on which traditional universities function, the old way of thinking, especially when you come to business schools, was rational and objective decision making based on measurable data. That is the old paradigm of thinking. And whereas when you're talking about pursuance of and commitment to and sensitivity to sustainable development goals, those are more universal, those are more inclusive, at the heart of which is empathy, at the heart of which is sensitivity to each other. And empathy, unlike the rational and objective paradigms that we are programmed to think in, is rooted in emotion. As we say, it is more an amygdala response rather than a cortex response, right? And that amygdala response, I don't think many of us are programmed to be in. I don't think we feel very comfortable. I mean, when we look around, a lot of us are rushing for closure. You know, we are historically programmed to avoid failure. Even when we talk a lot about training and development, etc., that's almost always a model which is reflection after the action, after we have done something. Yet, when we look around us, whether it is a COVID, whether it is our, this entire need to really be responsive to the immediacies of our nature, it requires us to uh, really not rush to closure too soon. In fact, it essentially says that deal with the ambiguities, be in the uncertainties, because we don't know what the future brings. But what it does need, as Jamil said a little while ago, is that inclusive, collaborative, breaking boundaries where people are going to come together, systems are going to come together, technology is going to come together in order to come up with solutions. Yet when we look at business schools, we're looking at silos operating where, and research, what gets measured, is, again, I keep saying this, these are my individual thoughts, so please don't quote me later that at an institutional level. But I think it is important as somebody or all of us who are in positions of responsibility to start looking at the paradigms and look at what kind of a curriculum do we need to develop, and more importantly, because even curriculum has got certain frames. I would much rather have frames that have porous boundaries where there is a lot of opportunities for collaborations to emerge. But how do we create an environment where we can enable our young people, our students, to fail early, to fail often? How do we create assessment mechanisms? How do you create structures where enduring this discomfort becomes the normalized new, where people are okay with ambiguity? And it's also, John, I mean, as you would appreciate, it is also a cultural issue, because there are certain cultures where high tolerance of ambiguity, as Lesley said, New Zealand is very, I mean, it operates in the post-materialistic society, which is very evolved in its way of thinking. Whereas there are many others, which, I mean, I come from India, where the tolerance of ambiguity perhaps is a little, not at the level, but then, yes, we also have a different way we tolerate ambiguity, because there's so much of chaos all around us all the time that we all have to navigate around it, right? So to conclude and not to go on forever, I would say that it is important for us to develop a context within educational institutions where the focus is really on enabling our young people to have the attitude of experimentation. That is extremely important. But what gets measured gets done. We talk about experimentation and then we start giving exams in an exam, context. That's not going to happen. So we really have to start looking at the models of education to see how do we create an environment where there is experimentation, constant experimentation. Second, I would think that every student of today or the leader of tomorrow is definitely requires to be conscious about the broader set of stakeholders. Even our panel today is called multi-stakeholder panel, and that multidisciplinary thinking. We talk a lot about the so-called T-shaped graduates today, that while we should have depth, we should also have breadth. So that multidisciplinary thinking should be embedded in our curriculum, and even as academics who are going to be facing these students, I think that multidisciplinary thinking should be part of the research spaces that we are embedded in. Extremely, extremely important. And the insularity, that is the academic institutions being insular from the real world, I think that needs to break down faster than earlier, because more and more our solutions need to come from those collaborative frameworks, which essentially means again, our mindsets should shift from a survival mentality of competition to an abundance mentality of the more we collaborate, the more we open up, the more we drive our thinking and learning from a position of security and not from a position of insecurity. I think then we start developing new ways of doing things. Yeah, that's what I would like to say.
So just a note for those of you listening, if you do have a question, just type it into the chat box so that we can go from there. So I guess what I'll do now is I'll ask a question and then ask for the other way. We'll we'll rotate the other way. So we'll start with Jaya, and then we'll go through Lesley and Jamil and Viswanath. So this way, everyone has an equal crack at it. It sounds like, based on what a lot of you are saying, is that we need more of these soft skills. We need culture change, right? So we need people to be more comfortable with failure and then to be able to bounce back. We need people to move on from just simple tolerance to really acceptance. And so my question is, we have so much in our curriculum that's built in already. How do we incorporate that skill building at a curricular level, right? How do we get students engaged with it? And so it's great that we have this group here, because we've got administrators, we've got people dealing with industry, we've got people who have done partnerships. I'd love to hear your thoughts, starting with Jaya, about how we do that.
No, that's a great question, John, because we do have a responsibility to look at what is the kind of context that we're creating when people come into our organizations and institutions. So when it comes to curriculum, absolutely, we have to look at what are the program outcomes. And something that we often do is, in fact, we have started to do increasingly in academic institutions that are focused on sustainability, is to ensure that at a programmatic level, when we're talking about learning outcomes, we are defining our learning outcomes with a clear focus on sustainability, with a clear focus on ethics, with a clear focus on responsible leadership, which essentially means, and once we have it at a programmatic level, then the curriculum management principles would ensure that it gets embedded then to the next level, where we start designing our subjects in alignment with these programmatic outcomes, and then we design our assessments in alignment with these subject level outcomes. So, there is definitely at an institutional level, when we say that there should be strategic alignment, even within the curriculum, there should be alignment such that we start from what is it that we're trying to achieve and define those outcomes very clearly, including many of these sustainable development goals, while at the same time, as Lesley talked about, the value-driven cultures, which is so fundamental to everything that we do. So it has to be embedded right at the level of the program level outcomes. And then, of course, we design our subjects and our assessments to ensure that those program outcomes are met. Now, at the same time, I must, specify that conceptualization is one thing, operationalization is another thing. John, you said that there is so much to cover. How do you do that at an institutional level? And I often have this discussion with my teams as well. So some of the things that we often focus on is what are the must knows, what are the could knows, what are the should knows? I mean, I think we must have a sense of what is it, what are some of our most important priorities, and how do we create an environment where students actually get the opportunity to engage with those divergent stakeholders. So even our assessments must be designed in such a way that these divergent stakeholders get involved early on. Somebody, for example, who's working in the NGO sector, for example, somebody who's working in the social sector, someone like Vishwanath, or who is working in the real industry, comes together, and then we design assessments in such a way that there is a very collaborative approach. Everybody takes responsibilities in some way to ensure that the students are getting the kind of mentoring, the kind of sponsorship, the kind of challenges or critical thinking that is necessary for them to develop that holistic thinking that is necessary to resolve many of the problems that we're currently facing, right? So again, I think I'm shifting the responsibility to beyond the academic to a larger group of people who get together, and collectively we start looking at, if this is the outcome that we need to reach, what is the kind of support that we need to bring in so that the students get that opportunity. So it is not only the design of courses, it is the delivery, and it is the context that we create within academic institutions so that students get an opportunity to fail early as well. So not sitting in the examination conditions and giving an exam kind of an assessment. I think we need to go beyond that and develop those assessments which are incremental, which are embedded in the real space, which is really focusing on solving problems. And again, I would think that the whole, today we talk a lot about design thinking and rapid prototyping. And rapid prototyping could be with regard to products, it could be with regard to services, it could be with regard to processes. That is something that we need to bring in, even at an institutional level, as to how do we come up with those early prototypes, that can be tested. And that also, the gig economy that we talk about today, the entrepreneurial mindset that we talk about, that has to be created. We have a responsibility as academics, as administrators, to create an environment where students get the opportunity to really start focusing on ideas which are leading to those products or services that are non-price differentiators. Increasingly, businesses are talking about non-price differentiators. I mean, they're saying revenue before cost. They're talking about better before cheaper. So this is what business needs, which essentially means somewhere the drivers of those should come from before, from institutions, academic institutions, but that cannot happen if institutions are operating in an insulated fashion. I feel people around us in that larger ecosystem, whether it is the government, the public sector, the private sector, should get together and start looking at curriculum to see how do we then embed it so that we are first articulate the program outcomes, and then we start, looking at the drivers, and then we start bringing in those experiences for students to develop those competencies and those attitudinal skills that is necessary to resolve those issues.
Lesley, do you want to jump in?
Please on mute.
I've had a few days without Zoom, and I've forgotten the process. So I just think I just like to add a few other things. I think that was already, I would have said very similar things in terms of curriculum, but I guess I'm again talking in terms of as a practitioner and no longer an academic. But one of the things that I think is challenging in a lot of our institutions is this whole idea of being able to draw from academic knowledge and as well as professional knowledge within our organizations. So, practitioners. And I guess I'm thinking about the whole idea of, I think what you said earlier was about giving people the opportunity to fail, because that's one way in which people learn. I think one of the things that I'd like to advocate for is that our institutions are also large service organizations with major environmental and social footprints. And, there's actually a huge benefit to be had from working with the practitioners within those organizations, so academics and practitioners teaming up. And I mean the sort of professional staff, or sometimes they're called various things, aren't they? But teaming up to actually design curriculums that basically will enable people to fail within the safe context of an institution, so an institution where they can be, that they can trust and they can feel is not sort of putting them out into the real world and giving them an opportunity to fail there, where that might have ramifications in terms of their confidence and sense of self-mastery. But if we did it carefully within the context of our institutions, we might be able to do a better job at having them able to do that iterative learning, which involves repeating and learning and trying again and doing so in a safe context before you actually have to do it in a much more public context. I also think I think some of the things that I think are really important here in terms of starting to really incorporate these into management education is ecological and social literacy. I still find that there is very little ecological literacy. These are the life-supporting systems that we rely on for our survival into the future, and equally one could say the social systems. And actually, trying to introduce as a sort of basic core an understanding, because I find that there is not a lot of that literacy around, certainly from an ecological point of view, but it would, obviously would vary in different cultures in terms of the social literacy. But I guess those soft skills, those emotional elements that others have talked about, but just trying to see if there's a way that these things can be built into understanding. I mean, some of the things I remember being incredibly powerful for me were when I had to go out into the field and had to go into not necessarily very physically safe environments, you know, and building that into management education. I've seen some fabulous experiential learning done outside, outdoors, in the wild, that really has a significant impact on people's hearts, you know, and their sense of how important these issues are as underpinning of everything we do. So yeah, that would be my little addition.
Jamil?
Yeah, maybe I want to start by saying that, and I think everyone in this panel would probably agree with this, that, you know, teaching content, like teaching the necessary business functions, marketing, finance, and whatnot, these are still essential. Obviously, we're not saying that these are not going to be important, but this is where we have to take that extra effort in a business school. There's this old notion that when you come to school, and it's almost maybe a negative perception, that school is a little sheltered environment where, on the one hand, I agree, you can make mistakes, even if the mistakes aren't going to be as consequential as the mistakes that will happen in the real world. So on the one hand, that's good. But there's also this idea of it being a controlled environment that is totally detached from the real world. And to be fair, business schools are less of that, because by nature it's practitioner oriented. But I think a challenge that business schools now have really is to mimic as close as possible the real world that students will actually have to live in and work in after. I'm going to start with something very basic, and perhaps some of you might say superficial: this whole digital environment. Working with global teams, working through Zoom, working asynchronously through Google Documents and whatnot. These are things which are relatively, part of the norm in the corporate environment or outside the university. But just judging from the response or the initial reaction of our students when we had to shift online within a week's time, when our country was basically put on lockdown, tells us of how, there seems to be a dichotomy that, when I'm in school, it has to be a professor in front. Sure, we're all case method, participant centered, but our students actually told us that we're paying for an environment where we can listen to a professor, talk to our peers, which is great. But then it also made us realize, hey, wait a minute, that's not exactly a good way for them to picture the world once they go outside, which is very much more global teams working asynchronously. The whole complaint about, oh, but my team member has bad internet connection. That's reality. Which brings me to my second point. I think more than just John, what are the things that we have to change in our curriculum to help build not just the skills of the future, but also the change in mindset, whether it's being innovative, being entrepreneurial, being willing to make mistakes, and being agile. It's the hidden curriculum. I know this has been used again and again and again in our conversations here at PRME and the UN Global Compact as well, but that is so important, I think even more so now. In fact, the way that we respond compassionately or not to our students, to our fellow faculty members during this crisis, teaches important lessons, deliberate or not, to our students. So I suppose all the more should we be more deliberate moving forward with regard to this hidden curriculum. Again, in something as superficial as a digital environment, that means, business schools, we really have to embrace digitally enabled learning experiences, so that not the content, but that hidden aspect of the curriculum also instills the skills and mindset of working and collaborating digitally. But also maybe even more action research, right? And action projects, which again, business schools have been experimenting on for quite a long time now, but this is a time to further accelerate it perhaps. And we look at now action orientedness, not just in helping out businesses, but maybe even business students working with government agencies or with the industry organizations, or even micro businesses. Maybe a lot of our MBA students wouldn't want to be assigned to help a little small mom and pop store because that's not their goal in life. But now is the time where perhaps they should be better aware of how big business can actually help small business. And there's so many opportunities for that now in this environment. So those are my insights with regards to your question, John.
on something which Jayashree mentioned, right? If you look at management education, it becomes far more easier to test the knowledge of something which is tangible, like finance, marketing, sales. Some of the things that we are saying is important for survival and corporate is a little difficult to test. And definitely not through a structured 2-hour or a 1-hour term exam, right? How do you test empathy using a case study? I mean, everyone is empathetic when you have to write a response. Everyone is fantastic in showcasing diversity when he writes or she writes a case paper, right? But I think the test, I don't have an answer for this, but the real test, as Jayashree said, is if you're saying empathy, the ability to be agile, acceptance of diversity, I think some of the curriculum, we need to really devise different kinds of, I don't want to say testing students, but I think we need to look at different ways of measuring whether they are really empathetic or not. Is psychometrics the answer? I don't know, right? But definitely, I think the stress on these schools is going to be, how do we really know whether our students have understood what empathy means, right? How do we really know whether they accepted diversity? Now, to start with, and this has been a common comment whenever I've gone to some of the B schools, either to teach or to recruit, there is a standard stereotype B school candidate to start with, right? And over years, I think the larger student fraternity have also started to beat the system. They know work X so many years, you have a certain NGO into your experience into your CV, you do well, you're sorted. Now, how do we break that mold? And especially I'm talking from a very Indian context, maybe it could extend to some of the Southeast Asian markets as well. I think diversity becomes from there. How many of the students in today's batch are painters? Or how many of them are musicians who have come back to study business? Right? Diversity becomes from there. We don't have answers. I don't have an answer. But I think if you realize this problem, at least the fact that we realize the problem will maybe help us move towards solving it. Right? So my first problem to restate is, how do we really measure some of these soft skills? How do we don't teach them from a case study, but mold them through life experiences? How can we make them really experience something and experience empathy in their campus life? I think that's the challenge, right? The other point is, I think somebody had also raised a question. We will come to that, but I just got tempted when I read it. Sustainability and business are not really contradictory to each other. Okay, you can have sustainable businesses which make money. In India, for example, there are lots of private equity funds who only focus on sustainable business models, right? They make money, the businesses make money. So I think the stress that somebody had asked was, students have this thing saying, we have come here to learn business. So we really don't want to take a subject on sustainability. I think somewhere it's been hard-coded that sustainability and business are, they don't go hand in hand. I think it's all the more important in today's global order, right? We have all been reading that the top 1% of the population today controls 50% of the wealth. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm not making a comment on that. But I'm saying that sustainable business models are all the more important. And that is what I think these schools have to really start communicating and teaching to the student fraternity. These were my 2 points on this question. Over to you, John.
Great, and so we have as Vishwanath alluded to, we've got a couple of questions in the chat box. One of them from Suzanne Young that's already been addressed, but another one that's come up that Jackie Johnson asked is this broader issue something that we can show with empirical evidence? And then I think linked is Hafsa Ahmed's point about trying to both deliver industry-ready graduates, right? So people who can go out and be employed relatively quickly. But how can we also merge that with the fact that we're often so in our research that it's hard for us as faculty members to really connect out to the outside world. So we're asking, I guess maybe this is me adding my own editorial perspective to it, but are we asking too much of faculty members who are training in PhD programs to then, after we train them in these methodologies that are highly ivory tower theoretical, to then be the nexus with the private sector, right? Where a lot of times they either don't know about, have no tolerance for, have no connection with the empirical work that's being done. So, and that's an open question to all five of you, is how do we do that? So how do we be that nexus when we're training our own people, right? The faculty members who we're training and the expectations that we have of them are very much not aligned with that kind of set of partnerships. Or they're sometimes not. If anyone wants to jump in.
May I,
Yeah.
John?
I,
That's a good question. I mean, that's a real good question. I mean, how do we converge? What are the points of convergence? In fact, academics are often seen as being a little rigid, slow, and I think I saw in one of the chats I was just going through elitist, quote unquote, which might be discrepant with fast-moving, application-oriented, outcomes that sometimes industry is looking for. Having said that, academic institutions historically have been those centers of learning, which ask the deeper question. While there is a lot of emphasis on, actionable knowledge, industry-specific skills in today's world, we must not forget that universities have always got an important role to play in those deeper, thinking in creating an environment where there is where students are compelled to go beyond the obvious, because it is also creating an environment where you're asking the right questions. It's not about defining solutions as much as developing the skill set and the mindset to ask the right questions. And I believe that universities should continue to focus on, creating that environment where we are challenging our students to go beyond the obvious, because that is what is required in today's world. Same time, to go back to your question, John, about methodology, it is right that I think in today's world, when we are compelled to manage for today, I mean, the operational efficiencies that every business is grappling with, even those businesses that are very committed to sustainable development goals, they do have a business to run on the day-to-day basis, and they're focused on operational efficiencies. But there are also those innovation operations within those same organizations, which is more about leading for tomorrow. And every leader is grappling with that. Every leader is compelled to manage for today and to lead for tomorrow, where they are asking the bigger questions in the leading for tomorrow. They want, people to get together, research and development teams to get together. And this is where academics can actually play a very, very important role in becoming part of these larger teams, where we start engaging in more immersive ethnographic approaches. I think it's important. Quantitative, of course, is important. I mean, it is that explanatory frameworks that we have, but we also have those exploratory frameworks. We're trying to define the problem, which sometimes, and I think Lesley mentioned it a while ago, is about coming up with contextually relevant fashion, or defining problems, understanding the contextually relevant issues. I mean, it's not somebody helicoptering solutions from outside and impinging, which was the traditional way of thinking. Now we say that go into the context. Again, digital technology, it is not always disruption. It's not always about technology. I think there is enough being written about the fact that technology is the tool. Disruption is really understanding the customer value chain and trying to identify what are those real issues that the customers are facing. And that is where entrepreneurs come in. The entire gig economy and the entrepreneurial ways of doing things is not as much about technology. I think it is not technology that is a disruptor. It has been said by authors before that it is the consumer that is becoming the disruptor. More and more, in fact, the Gen X, for example, are becoming Gen Y or Gen Z. I think it is the Gen Z. I keep, confused, but the new people, the new young people, when we talk to them, I feel very encouraged because they're very aware. First off, they're very conscious. They're also operating in an environment where it's a post-materialistic society that many of them, again, I'm talking only about the privileged people who can afford university education. I'm not generalizing. There are many who still cannot afford university education, and that's problematic. I think we have a responsibility to create environments where university education becomes accessible to more and more people, right? But not to digress too far away from the question, that it is important for us to have more conversations with divergent sets of stakeholders in order for us to break down some of those boundaries, because we have something to offer and an industry has questions and they have something to offer, and hence I keep emphasizing the necessary importance of moving away. Businesses have moved away from creating value for just shareholders. The fact that we're talking about SDGs essentially means that it is not only the shareholders that are important, it is also a divergent set of stakeholders, which essentially means those divergent set of stakeholders should be brought in early on in order to come up with collaborative solutions. And academics do have a responsibility to be embedded in those contextual spaces. I think consciously we need to take that responsibility to ensure that we also try and break some of those boundaries that have existed. And I think it is falling. Those boundaries are falling increasingly. There are so many collaborations. One of the encouraging things that I see is funding bodies are increasingly funding research that is multidisciplinary, that is focused on global challenges, which is again giving a signal to the academics that we need to get out of our I think way of thinking to become a little bit more broader while still maintaining the depth, that critical thinking that really is required at this point of time.
And it's at that point that that's a good place to stop. So we've got to switch over to the main session. Thank you so much to the panelists, and thank you for those of you who have stuck around here to listen to this great discussion. Hopefully it was informative, and hopefully it gave everybody some food for thought in how they can promote these building and the process in their institutions. All right, thanks everybody again, and see you on the stage in a couple of minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great to connect with you. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.